The Erie Canal, an engineering marvel, an industrial feat, and an illustrious symbol of the Empire State. Or that's at least what some of your teachers taught you, right? For many marginalized communities, history is more complicated than what was taught in social studies class, especially when it comes to our country's most cherished landmarks. This is Canal Keepers, a podcast where we tell the stories of the people who keep the Erie Canal relevant today. I'm your host, Gloria Rivera. On this episode, we've got some new teachers for you to debunk the historical narratives of the canal you might have heard in school or seen in the news. Your first teacher is Danielle Nagel. She's the executive director of the Matilda Joslyn Gage Foundation. The museum honors the work of Matilda Joslyn Gage, a Central New York abolitionist and suffragist from the 19th century. Danielle gave us a tour of the foundation. She told us to feel free to touch the displays and make ourselves at home.
We don't want you to feel like you're in a museum where you can't. We want you to feel at home here, basically. It's Matilda's home. That's how we try to present it to folks.
In the 1800s, the Erie Canal was one of New York's proudest accomplishments. But the canal's construction wasn't a positive change for everyone. Danielle's research centers on the lesser-known aspects of Erie Canal heritage. We asked Danielle why it can be hard to explore the aspects of history that make some people uncomfortable.
When you start to talk about these other more complicated aspects of the Erie Canal history, there's like a cognitive dissonance or something's coming up, I think, for people where they can't reconcile what they've been told their whole lives with this other aspect of history. And that's why I think it's so important that we start talking about the full complex picture and all the nuance involved in it, because a lot of the details have been left out of the history, and people need all of the facts, need all of the information, I think, if we're going to start to shift and be more cognizant of the Erie Canal as not so positive of a thing.
Danielle's research found the success of the Erie Canal often came at the expense of the rights and land of indigenous communities. During Danielle's tour of the Matilda Joslyn Gage Foundation, she showed us the Haudenosaunee Room. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, meaning people of the Longhouse, is made up of the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas, groups native to New York State and parts of Canada.
We are on the traditional lands of the Onondaga Nation, and so it's really important that we acknowledge that and center that, because this was where the oldest democracy was established, and it's not the U.S. democracy, it's the democracy of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And that is where the founding fathers actually got a lot of their ideas to write our Constitution and form our democracy.
Danielle's research centers on the lesser-known and more complicated aspects of Erie Canal heritage. In 1779, General George Washington, yes, that George Washington, ordered Sullivan's March. It was a military expedition led by two Continental Army generals, John Sullivan and James Clinton. The campaign targeted some members of the Haudenosaunee who supported the British and others who remained neutral during the American Revolutionary War.
And that was actually a genocidal campaign that George Washington asked General Sullivan and Clinton to go on, and included the destruction of over 40 Haudenosaunee villages. And so we see that connection from 1779 through the 1790s, and then ultimately the Erie Canal construction begins in 1817. And so that, I think, really shows a different perspective on what actually was involved in being able to construct the Erie Canal.
Danielle taught us that a lot of details have been left out of the history of the Erie Canal. Your next teacher is Dana Olush, an anthropology researcher at Syracuse University. Dana is a trained historian and spent the past few years researching how violence and inequality affect urban spaces. We sat down with Dana to understand what life was like for those living alongside the canal.
Despite these beautiful, picturesque landscapes that we see of the Erie Canal, like represented in a lot of modern day and even contemporary artwork to that time, the canal was kind of this huge, like, slimy pit of grossness.
While the canal is presented in New York State history as an engineering wonder, researchers like Dana found the Erie Canal harmed vulnerable populations.
So one of the benefits of a canal is that it's largely standing water, which means that it's not like a river, you're not having a fresh flow of water coming in, which means that that water can stagnate. And we also know, based on like oral histories, I've spoken with like many descendants of those who worked on the Erie Canal. They prided it, like the business people, like the restaurant owners, those who had this economic wealth, frequently prided themselves on dumping things into the Erie Canal. And so they had kind of this transitory existence around the canal. Like they may like go and work along the canal or like sell their goods along the canal. But the people who are actually living next to the canal, who are having to deal with the pollution and the constant smell and just the reputation of the space, is going to be predominantly Black American populations, as well as we do see Indigenous American, Asian American, and again these white ethnic immigrants that are kind of like occupying this liminal space.
Dana's current research focuses on the 15th Ward, a historically Black neighborhood in Syracuse. It was located along the canal and experienced the canal's pollution as a result. In the early 1950s, research shows this area was somehow considered diseased or dirty, as were the people that were living there. By 1923, the Erie Canal was effectively no longer in use in Syracuse. By 1950, the construction of the Interstate 81 Viaduct, or I-81, displaced longtime residents there and essentially demolished the 15th Ward, wiping out the homes of many Black, Jewish, and immigrant families in the process.
Basically, the vulnerability that was created by the Erie Canal and the pollution of the Erie Canal and the reputation of the Erie Canal and those who are who are living on the Erie Canal persists into kind of the creation of I-81 and the devaluing of their lives as well. We see people getting sick from the exhaust from I-81. We see increases of pollution because of all the cars. This is, again, a infrastructure project that is being used to devalue human life, but specifically Black American human life. It's not just a parallel, it is this long trajectory of municipal officials, landlords, all of these different empowered people basically saying these populations do not deserve the same rights as them.
There was a debate about where to construct I-81. One proposal suggested demolishing the historic Wheelock building, which is now the Erie Canal Museum. The other option? Bulldoze the 15th Ward. So what happened? Renee Barry wanted to know. She's your third and final teacher today. Renee was the Erie Canal Research Fellow for the Erie Canal Museum. She has done extensive research on the Erie Canal and the 15th Ward.
When I started working at the Erie Canal Museum, my colleague Derek, he, on my first day of work, started telling me this story about how the Erie Canal Museum almost was lost when a new transportation revolution was coming through Syracuse, and that was the building of interstate highways. And so I'm interested in the way that this transportation revolution of interstate highways is similar and repeats the same patterns as the transportation revolution of canal building, and how these infrastructure projects by the state dispossess marginalized groups.
As a result of lobbying from canal lovers, the governor diverted the route of I-81 to the east, sparing the Erie Canal Museum. The 15th Ward, however, wasn't as lucky. I-81 was constructed, displacing the residents of the ward. Researchers like Renee teach us how throughout history, certain voices, especially those of Indigenous and Black communities, have been sidelined, but their experiences are integral to the canal story.
Except I think it's important to acknowledge that one of them was a home, one of them was a community, and the other one was preserved for the sake of the memory of the Erie Canal. And that's why today we still have the Erie Canal Museum. And as we know, we don't have the 15th Ward anymore. So this very complicated, complex history of Erie Canal preservation, I think, gets into questions of like, what do we value? What do we preserve? And whose voices get listened to?
Ahead of the upcoming bicentennial of the Erie Canal, more New Yorkers and researchers are paying attention to the canal than ever. Scholars are working to expand narratives, but not everyone is on board.
The Erie Canal is often talked about as turning New York into the Empire State. And when I raise questions about, what does empire really mean? It gets into these themes of the violence and the erasure and the domination of aspects of Erie Canal and American history that many people have not been taught. And they've actually been taught these myths about American history, like New York being a wilderness and being unsettled before the canal, or Syracuse being a swamp land with no one living in it before the canal. These things aren't true, but if you've been taught them your whole life, it's hard to unlearn them suddenly. So what I've gained an appreciation for is that this is a long process of unlearning and reframing the new information that we have today to make a new type of story.
Canal Keepers is a production of students at the S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. This episode was reported by Isabel Bekele, written by Bibiana Snyder and Isabel Bekele, and edited by Lauren Davis. Produced by Dan Klosowski, who also composed our intro music. Check out our website, canalkeeperspod.com. There you can learn more about all things Erie Canal, the 15th Ward, and Indigenous communities in Central New York. And follow us on Instagram, @CanalKeepers. I'm your host, Gloria Rivera. Thanks for listening.